Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us from today. A very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nasimiyu Esther-Blessing, and welcome to the Kabarak University Press webinar titled Space, Debris, and International Law. And today we are honored to have a stellar, distinguished panel today to lead our discussions whom I will introduce shortly. And we, our Kabarak University Press, are in fact privileged to host International Law Month at Kabarak 2025. And at the University Press, we believe that a global South academic publisher must be proactive in enabling scholarly conversations and reflections that answer to the intellectual questions of our times. And it is in this spirit that we have convened this webinar today. So, the International Law Month at Kabarak is an annual month-long series of activities which are in fact aimed at highlighting the international law questions relevant to the Global South today. And this year is the first of these intellectual focus months. It will entail a series of webinars which we have been announcing and the launch of a blog on international law named in honor of Bonaya Ghana, whose legacy we will discuss in the webinar on 18th July 2025. Kabarak University Press is also happy to remind you that Kenya has a candidate for the elections to the International Court of Justice of November 2026, a close friend and supporter of Kabarak University Press, Prof. Phoebe Okoa, and we are honored to support and contribute to Prof. Okoa's candidacy. Look at our social media handles for this. And to start us off will be Ms. Mukulu Kioko. She is a Kenyan lawyer working at the intersection of law, policy, and government relations. She spends most of her time thinking and promoting sustainable use of space, primarily in support of ground-based astronomy through forums such as the UN Corpus and supporting organizations to achieve their missions through strategy development, government relations, and building and managing external partnerships. So welcome, Ms. Mukulu.
Thank you very much, Nasimiyu. Please let me know if you can hear me okay. And if you cannot at any point, please feel free to stop me and let me know that I'm not clear. You have kindly agreed to help me share my slides, so please do that for me. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I shall not say much more, only just to point out that I am a Kenyan lawyer and I am also Kenyan trained. And I think that bit for me is always important, so that people know that my early schooling was actually done in Kenya, although I don't work in Kenya at the moment. Right, so we're going to talk about space sustainability and the legal aspects of space sustainability. And I am lucky to be joined by two colleagues, Thando and Tanushri, who you will meet. We have divided this webinar into three categories. So I will do the introduction, which talks a bit about the legal framework. Thando will then talk to us about why space is important. And the reason we've included this is because I know that sometimes people ask for a bit of contextualization, i.e., what are the benefits of space? Why should we be concerned with the preservation of space? So Thando will help us contextualize that a little bit. And then Tanushri will very kindly talk to us about some of the uncontrolled debris activity that we have seen in the recent past. So space debris, but then some of with some examples, again, to help us contextualize the discussion on the impact of space debris. So, shall we start with part one, please? I thought that this might be a good place to start, to talk a little about the international legal framework that governs space. There are in total 5 treaties. I am going to highlight 3, but I should mention that there's 2 others. There's the Moon Agreement, which talks about and governs lunar activity globally. You might ask what sort of activity is going on in the moon, and I'll tell you that people are talking about wild and wonderful things like mining in the moon and potentially doing science in the moon and all sorts of research activities. There's also the Rescue Agreement, which is, talks about rescuing of astronauts. So when people are sent to space, if they get stuck and they cannot come back, what happens then? For the sake of our discussion today, I'd like to highlight the Outer Space Treaty, the Registration Convention, and the Liability Convention. The Outer Space Treaty is actually the primary governing legislation on this. It offers a set of principles for space activity, and we will talk in the next slide, not yet, but we'll talk in the next slide about which principles these actually are. And then we have the Registration Convention and the Liability Convention. Now, the reason these two are important is because the Liability Convention addresses the issue of what happens when there's a problem. Now, it's important that I say that these treaties were first developed at a time where we did not send that many things to space. For the longest time, actually before 2013, there was only perhaps under 100 objects that went to space in a year. And this went to the geostationary orbit. We'll talk about this in a little while. But since then, this has increased. And so some of the challenges we're seeing now is because a lot of the legislation that we're using was drafted quite some years back. The Liability Convention then addresses if something falls from space into your backyard and damages your house or your cowshed, who do you sue for compensation? Then we have the Registration Convention, which came about when countries realized that it is important that people register. How do you know who belongs, who owns what, right? So different countries will deploy different things into space. But now there's an obligation for them to maintain a domestic register. Again, I should emphasize that we don't have an international register just yet, but each country is supposed to maintain its own domestic register and then notify the Secretary General of the United Nations of the existence of this register and what is in it. The idea behind this is that if something then fell in your backyard, again, you would know who it belongs to and you would know who to speak to because you can trace it back to an owner. So if you wanted, for example, to start studying or to start researching on these things, this would be my recommendation on where to start in the sense of the international legal framework. Next slide, please. So then we talk a little bit about a high-level summary of guiding principles. Now, if you're interested in any other global commons, or if you've been studying environmental law, if you've been studying law of the sea, some of these things you'll be familiar because they're not that far-fetched, because they're not that different. Now, the Outer Space Treaty talks about that space must be used for the benefit of all humankind. No one state should claim sovereignty or no one state should claim stake in space. Now, in reflecting of how human beings have governed Earth, right, and how inequality has plagued different sections of the world, you would see why this is important, why it's a resource that's for everybody, and no one state should be able to say that this is mine, that I use this now. It should be used only for peaceful purposes. Now, contextually, especially now, in light of the current geopolitical happenings globally, you could see why some countries might be concerned about the using of space to place nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in orbit or in other celestial bodies. However, the Outer Space Treaty, which more than 100 countries have signed up, including Kenya and most of the spacefaring nations, have agreed that they shall only use space for peaceful purposes. If you wanted to write a paper at this point, or if you wanted to do an academic exercise, you could reflect on what that means, for instance, because we are living in a time and witnessing a lot of non-compliance with international law. So it might be that you're asking, but then does that mean anything? Now, the United Nations Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that meets once a year, but then that has two subcommittees that also meet once a year, has asked the countries to commit to this. The countries to commit to, regardless of what is happening, that space shall only be used for peaceful purposes. And then lastly, and perhaps more important for our conversation today, states shall be responsible for national space activities. In this case, whether the state is launching an object or whether an object is being launched by a non-government entity, but from that jurisdiction, the state should still be responsible. So for example, if let's say a company from country X launches something from Kenya, Kenya is still responsible over that, and Kenya is still required to register that as being part of the things that have been deployed or be, from its jurisdiction. So have that in mind as we go through the rest of the session and talk about the subsequent slides. Next, please, Nasimiyu. So then why are we talking about this now, right? What are some of the threats that we are experiencing on space sustainability? I borrowed a definition and then I simplified it. So NASA, for example, offers a longer definition of what space sustainability is. But for the purposes of my presentation, I'm adapting a simplified definition, which is efforts of maintaining space for long-term use. Now, we need space, and Thando will talk about some of the reasons for why we need space. And so we need to preserve it so we can leave it usable for as long as possible. Then why? Why does it matter now? We've seen an increase in space debris. So earlier I talked about geostationary orbit. So the people who deploy things to space will tell you that we have two sorts of orbits. Now, you will know that this is way out of my realm of expertise, but I'll try and explain what that means. So low Earth orbit is between about 80 kilometers to, I'm going to say about 2,000, 2,500, depending on who you ask, from the equator up, okay? And then GEOs are up to 34,000 kilometers up. Now, for the low Earth orbit, a lot of them we can see in a dark sky. Now, if you look up in places where, I don't know, think Starlink, think OneWeb, those sorts of things go to the low Earth orbit. And it's the satellites that are going to low Earth orbit that we're noting an increase in. For instance, before 2019, post 2019, the statistics say that we're launching between 800 to 1,000 annually, which if you look at the statistics pre-2013, where we were talking about perhaps 70, 80 some years, and not all years, it's an increase, right? And so people send, and different companies and countries that have invested in certain companies deploy satellites to low Earth orbit. And a lot of times there's a plan for decommissioning and for controlled re-entry into Earth so that it doesn't form part of space debris, but not always. There's been increase of floating space debris. There's been increase in the threat of collision. So because we don't yet have a good international regime that talks about who's controlling what, we're seeing threats of perhaps two satellites from two different companies colliding. However, most of these companies are working together to try and communicate to mitigate that and to prevent that. But that's happening, and the increase in things being deployed, the satellites being deployed to low Earth orbit, then raises a concern. We have increased launches of also registration of mega satellite constellations. So the International Telecommunications Union, which is the oldest international organization in the world, deals with the allocation of orbital slots. Now, for you to deploy, you have to register with the ITU. You have to apply to the ITU, actually, I think that's the right term, for them to allocate you an orbital slot. We've seen an increase in that. My personal reflection on it is that some of the countries that are filing now are using it for speculative. So, for example, a partnership between Rwanda and Canada has filed for up to 200,000 satellites to launch, and they're waiting to see if the ITU approves the allocation, just as an example. Then we have brightening of the night sky. There's a lot of effort that's going into this. There are communities that use it for their cultural heritage and indigenous populations that feel personally afflicted by the ever-increasing brightening of the night sky. I recently read some very interesting research that's coming out of MIT that talks about the impact of a brightening night sky on people's sleep cycles and the general health of the human population. And one of the things that I work on is the impact of the brightening night sky on astronomy. And that could be, a conversation on its own. But basically what that means is that astronomy relies on what we call dark and quiet skies. And so if it's very bright, and telescopes mostly work at night after the sun has gone down, it means that the sky is too bright. And sometimes when the telescopes are being directed at where to look in the sky, it's not always possible to tell if they're looking at a star or an exoplanet, or if they're looking at a satellite. And then we have the growing carbon footprint. There's a lot of conversation now about the correlation between space and environmental impacts and climate change. And there's an over-reliance on company policies and absence of space traffic coordination and space traffic management programs. What has happened now is people have relied on policies by the companies and conversations between different institutions and the companies to mitigate. So, for example, astronomers are working closely with SpaceX to change slightly the design of their satellites to reduce the impact of the satellites on astronomy. I know other organizations, for example, that deal with Night Sky and Darkness are talking about exploring whether satellite companies can dim them slightly at night as they fly over their residential areas or places where people sleep or places where people use the sky for religious purposes, for example. But I guess the reason I added that there is that you can reflect on the idea of how sustainable is it that we rely on company policies and that we rely on the goodwill of companies, or vis-a-vis having some sort of international regime or domestic regimes that have requirements for companies to comply. Next, please, Nasimi. So what are we doing then to address the threats? There's domestic level, which some countries are working hard to improve domestic legislation to address increasing space capacity. So for example, the Netherlands now is including a licensing requirement for all low Earth orbit and also geostationary orbit, that countries must declare what their plan is for controlled re-entry. And you must commit to following certain regulations to ensure that your object is not just going to land in space in an uncontrolled way. There is evolution of spectrum management that's being handled by the International Telecommunications Union, and they're trying to ensure that there's no loophole in the sense that all the spectrum, regardless of where you're launching to orbit, is managed under the ITU so that more people can register. The United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or the UN COPUOS, is in the process of stimulating the development of soft law. For example, they have published some guidelines on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. Germany, as part of UN COPUOS, has recently convened a working group on the legal aspects of space traffic coordination and space traffic management. And all this is in a bid to try and establish some sort of soft law that eventually, hopefully, will evolve into a binding international instrument that guides the use of space and that pronounces itself on the sustainable uses of space. Interestingly, there's also a lot of technical interventions, and I know that Thando will touch on this briefly. For example, there's software development in software for tracking of space debris. There's partnership between space agencies like the European Space Agencies and astronomical observatories that are based in very dark and quiet places to position telescopes that are specifically used to track space debris. There's a lot of work going on to model the threshold. So what is the maximum number of satellites that can go to space? Personally, I don't like that question of the number because I think that there's other metric that we could use, like brightness. But then it's also asking, do we need as many as we are sending up to do the things that we're doing? Or is it also turning into another capitalist economic venture for humankind and for private corporations, etc.? So these are some of the things that are happening now. And these are some of the things that scholars are starting to think about and people who are interested in the field are starting to write on. I should say that the literature on this is still very thin. And more specifically, the literature on this coming from the global majority is very thin. And so one of the reasons Mr. Sipala and I decided to convene this is because we'd like to encourage more scholarly works coming from the global majority, specifically from Africa, around this subject. Next, please, Nasimiyu. So what comes next? Development of soft law, which I've touched on, considerations of an internationally legally binding instrument, evolution of domestic legislation. So Kenya, for example, is in the process of getting a Kenya Space Act approved. Last year, they ran a consultation on the Kenya Space Bill. And part of what they had included in there, and part of what some of us recommended them included some more stringent licensing requirements, especially once we start to allow SpaceX and OneWeb and anyone else who might come asking, that we require them to show a good plan on how they control re-entry into Earth. The two last ones I've talked about, increased voices in the global majority and opportunities for upcoming lawyers to join the discourse and to contribute to it. Now, my 15 minutes are nearly up, but I think I have one last slide, Nasimiyu, don't I? I thought to include this, and I should say that I've sent some resources to Nasimiyu, and she's kindly agreed to circulate this at the end of it. I wanted to signpost to some things that you could look at if you wanted to get more involved or if you were curious and wanted more information around this. There's a workshop that's coming up in December that I would encourage you to look into if you're interested, because up until the 31st of July, you could apply for some stipend to attend, and this is specifically for the students. And that's interesting because it has a policy day. That's just a day dedicated to the legal and policy aspect, but it also offers you an opportunity to interact with people from industry and academics, astronomers, for example, on the subject. The other one I'd like to flag is number 3 on the list, which is the International Astronomical Union Center for Protection of Dark and Quiet Skies. They have different hubs, which is different collections of people from all over the world. Now, I am a member of the Policy Hub, and we do not have enough African students. Actually, we don't have enough people from the global majority period, so Africa, India, that sort of thing. So please have a look at it. If you're interested in this area, please register to become a member of the Policy Hub and to participate. And what that means is that you join a group of people who are spending some time thinking about these things and sharing information amongst themselves. And then the Space Generation Advisory Council, I'll ask Tanushri during her slot to please talk about it because she has participated in activities of the Space Generation Advisory Council. Thank you very much. That's me.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mukulu, for your concise discussion on and laying the basis for our current conversation. So everyone, allow me to welcome the next speaker. He is Thando, and he's the co-founder of Spatial Sense based in Zimbabwe, which focuses on solving developmental challenges using geospatial technology, particularly in land resource management and development projects. He spends his time researching and writing about the trajectory of space policy and is an optimist for Africa's space programs. Welcome, Thando.
Thank you very much. I've just attempted to share my screen. I hope that is working.
Yes, it is.
Great. My name is Thando, and as introduced by Esther, I co-founded a startup called Spatial Sense, based in Zimbabwe. And for most of my career, I've been doing geographic information systems. But then I started off in land governance because I am trained as a geomatics practitioner and as a land surveyor or land survey engineer, depending on how you call it. And right out of school, I started off working for the government, which is quite a peculiar route for a young person. But I was working for the Zimbabwe Land Commission, and we were looking at the sustainability aspects of how we manage our land. As you know, if you have any legal interests outside of Kenya, you will know that Zimbabwe has one of the very interesting land questions in Africa. And so while doing that job, I was sort of leading the GIS and the remote sensing side of things in terms of mapping this land and how best to do that. Later on, I transitioned then into the startup world because I felt government was too slow for me. Then I started looking into how best can I use Earth observation to solve challenges in a commercial level. So I've done work in agriculture, mining, housing development. And then in that, I then got to a point where I was tired. I'm like, okay, I've made so many maps, I've flown so many drones, I'm enjoying this technology, but I'm playing within a certain space where I don't make the rules. So now I need to be able to contribute to conversations that end up making the rules. And that's when I stumbled into space policy and strategy. My interest really peaked in 2023 when I attended the IAC through the Space Generation Advisory Council that Mukulu mentioned. And since then, I've been engrossed in the world of space policy and strategy. And currently, I'm in the UK, and I'm interested in how we're using space to solve for challenges in climate, and also space in development, which we'll talk about later. And most recently, my interest peaked in space sustainability and in space security. I'm still learning a lot about space security, but while at that, you'll find me spending most of my time encouraging the building of startups in Zimbabwe, particularly in the geospatial space and in Africa as a whole. And I'm also interested in AI for Earth observation and the governance of AI. So I'm one of those people whom you would call a scatterbrained person. And that's basically me. Now, when we're talking about Earth observation, it sounds very technical, but trust me, it is not. If I'm going to simplify it, it is simply throwing a camera into the air and letting it take pictures of what it is seeing on the ground. That is Earth observation. And we do that by launching satellites into the sky, and then we take pictures of the Earth, and then we study those pictures. So since we've been doing this for a long time, we can look at pictures from the past and analyze what has changed so far by looking at pictures of the present. And by doing that, we can also predict the changes that are coming. Say, oh, if it happened like this a couple of years ago, I think maybe in the next few years, it's going to happen like this. So in that regard, Earth observation allows you to do time travel. You can look to the past, the present, and then also predict the future. Mukulu has touched briefly on sort of the types of orbits that we have. Most interestingly is low Earth orbit these days, because the conversation is around Starlink and internet and satellite-based internet. That is low Earth orbit. It simply means that the satellites are closer to Earth. And then we also have satellites that we use to study the weather and predict the weather. And those satellites maintain the same position relative to the Earth. So if you look upwards, that satellite seems as if it is only looking at one place on the Earth. And we use those satellites to monitor our weather. And they are very high in the sky. So those are called the geostationary orbit. Literally stationary, meaning that they are not moving relative to the Earth. And then we also have in between, where with the medium Earth orbit. That's where we throw satellites mostly for navigation, like GPS, which is the most popular, that's the American version, or GLONASS, which is the Russian version. And then you have Compass with Galileo, the Europeans, and so forth. And while we're at it, we also attach different types of cameras to these satellites. So sometimes we want these cameras to only capture in infrared, so just looking at heat signatures on the Earth. Sometimes we want to look at certain minerals on the Earth or certain elements on the Earth. So we want to capture beyond the colors that we see, because the human eye can see what we call RGB. It's a spectrum of colors like red, green, blue. And depending on how you combine those things, that's how you get the colors. You know, if you've been confused at a wedding, someone says, oh, come to my wedding, you should be wearing champagne. It's like, oh, what is this color? It's basically a combination within that RGB. That's what we can see with the human eye. But then the colors beyond that, and we use satellites to do that. It allows us to study different types of things that we would not be able to study with our eyes. So that data then comes back to Earth, and then we process it, and then we analyze it and make all sorts of different types of it. So with this, you've just done a crash course on Earth observation. You're now experts in Earth observation. So, I mean, are we doing too much of this? I don't know. But if you look at this video, it's just showing how much objects we have launched into space, and how that is affecting sort of the atmosphere around Earth. Like Mukulu was saying, there's a lot of conversations around how best do we govern the launch of these vehicles. So as you can see, as time goes on, you can see that there's an increasing number of objects closer to the Earth and even further from the Earth. So we're basically throwing trash into the atmosphere and the high atmosphere. So in this case, it is into space. And most of our conversations have shifted throughout the years from can we launch objects into space, into conversations where we are saying, what is the limit to what we can launch into space? So as you saw in that video, if you come towards the end here, you see that the space is now crowded compared to when we started here in the mid to early 90s, where there was just a few objects in space. And now we're at a point where some consortia are saying we want to launch more than 100,000 satellites into space. And why are they doing this? Why then are we getting to a point where we're asking if this is even enough? The argument is we understand the Earth better if we look at it from afar. So if we study Earth using Earth observation technologies, we understand it better. For socioeconomic development, we can study our agriculture and we can predict the yields that we're going to get. We can study our soils and understand, okay, what crops can we plant here that will make Africa self-sufficient in terms of food, for example. When we're arguing that, oh, Africa has so many mineral resources and so forth, the way we explore them is we take pictures of the Earth using satellites, and then we study those pictures, and then we're like, oh, there's so much gold in Zimbabwe, or there's so much gold in Kenya. And so that's our argument to say, okay, we need to keep launching. And also, of course, with the, the biggest concern right now is climate change and sustainability. We also study it better if we're looking at it from space. So that is the argument. And also some commercial uses that are not quite popular because these are not really Earth observation. They come from PNT. PNT stands for positioning, navigation, and timing. If you didn't know, your banking and finance and global trade and logistics all depend on satellites. When I send you money at 12 noon and you receive the money at 1 p.m. and then I argue that, no, I sent it at 12, and then you're saying, no, you sent it at 1 because you're using a different time zone. The only time that can unite us is the time that we measure from space. So that is where it comes in. And also in terms of insurance, this is a particular use case where insurance companies will study certain conditions on the Earth to say, oh, okay, I think this place is prone to wildfires, or this place is prone to flooding. So if we issue insurance to these guys at a lower price, we are going to suffer when they claim in the end. So let's insure them at a high price. So decisions like those are all made from space, and you just don't know it until you start to find out. So I hope I have piqued your interest in Earth observation, and you look into it, because there's a lot of opportunities there, commercially, legally, as well as scientifically. And Africa has also decided that, okay, no, we're not going to be left out in this space race. And close to 25 African countries now have space programs, and we have launched collectively close to 60 satellites. And most of these satellites that we're launching as Africa are Earth observation satellites, because going back to the previous slide, we believe that if we launch Earth observation satellites, we'll develop faster and better because we're studying our environments better. And the budgets also speak for themselves. From an African perspective, $500 million in total dedicated to space technology. That is quite huge, because space is not even that popular yet. And then when it gets popular, you can imagine the kind of budgets that we're going to be having. And of particular interest, of course, is Kenya. They launched 2 satellites. And in 2018, first, it was an experiment to see, okay, how can we do this? And then when we understood that, okay, now we can do this better, we launched a satellite called Taifa 1 from Kenya. And I think there's another satellite which came after that. I'll confirm the details. And to also unify the way we govern space and the way we launch into space, we launched the African Space Agency and to say, okay, collectively, what can we do to coordinate space activities across the continent? Which takes me to my next slide. There is a set of documents, 2 documents important on a continental level. That is the African Space Policy document and the African Space Strategy document. So the African Space Policy, it focuses on creating an encouraging environment for a coordinated and integrated African space program. It helps countries develop sort of supporting regulations, and also from an African Union perspective, how best can we together do space? And some of the objectives in that include to develop an indigenous regional market, so that we don't have to depend on others primarily for these services. Because if you imagine the way Africans love football, and we're doing all this streaming of football using external satellites from outside Africa, why can't we launch for our billions of football supporters in Africa and also harness the profits? So that's what the African space policy encourages. And then the African space strategy, you have to imagine a strategy as the way in which we operationalize policy. So we say, okay, policy is this, but then how are we going to achieve the goals in the policy? That is our strategy. So that's how it works. And the African space strategy then has some objectives, that enable funding, the sustainability of those funds, how best do we develop human capital, how do we train the talent, what sort of institutions do we require in order for us to create a stable or a competitive space industry. And so it is some of the goals which include research and development. And if you then look at the history of space in Africa, you will find that in recent years, we've actually had very good commercial strategies emerging outside of Africa, inside of Africa, I'm sorry. Like if you look at companies like CubeSpace in South Africa or Sumera Sense, who are developing satellite components within Africa where we don't need to import. And then when you look at a country like Cote d'Ivoire, which recently entered the space race, they are saying, oh, we're totally committed to developing our satellite locally. So that's what the African space strategy encourages. So I hope increasingly we'll get to start to see indigenous potential really being harnessed. And I really like to talk about that indigenous potential because the goal is to develop space capacity and capabilities. So the difference between capacity and capabilities is capabilities talk about our ability to harness the resources from space and the benefits of space. But then how do we measure our ability to harness those resources? That is where our capacity comes in. So we're looking at, does the regulatory framework allow us to do that? Does the human capital that we have allow us to do that? What are the funding mechanisms that allow us to do that? So that is how we sort of estimate our space capacity. And it is important for us to develop sovereign capabilities within the continent, because usually what comes with developing a space industry is that other industries that are linked to the space industry start to develop, and we get a trickle down of benefits in local industry, from manufacturing to pharmaceuticals to agriculture and so forth. And the other reason is, while space is important for socioeconomic development, it is a major player or a major benefit in terms of conflict and security. So now, if you depend externally on your space technology, if you depend on foreign actors for your space technology, it might also mean that you are depending on foreign actors for a technology that can either arm you or disarm you. So that is why it is quite important. And also another important point, which I'm going to take time on, unfortunately, is how do we negotiate deals between African countries and countries outside Africa when we want to cooperate? Because it is a fact that other continents are far ahead of us in terms of space technology development. So when we want to develop, we go then and collaborate and say, okay, let's work together and help us develop this. But what are the terms of negotiation? We have to be mindful when we do that, because sometimes you then have a point where if someone does something for you, then you now owe them. And sometimes the terms that they negotiate on with you give them some form of power over you. For example, we have seen recently articles, if you check the BBC, one of the guys from Nigeria, his name is Temi from Space in Africa. He was on the BBC podcast. It was a good episode. You should definitely check it out, because I think there was a lady from Kenya as well, talking about how Starlink is now being used for negotiations in geopolitics. We've seen it being used in South Africa. We saw it being used in the Congo recently. So that is something that we need to be careful of. And I understand most of us in the audience have a legal background, so you should definitely look into that, how Starlink is being used for geopolitical negotiations. And then just an introduction to space debris, which Tanushri is going to touch a lot on. When we're looking at Africa from space, and the pink dots they represent the amount of trash, the amount of rubbish that we've put into space. That is what it looks like. Of course, it's sort of exaggerated for us to see, but then we have a company called Leo Labs that is doing amazing work in tracking space debris and how it is affecting the space environment. And so that's just a visualization to help you understand how much we have polluted space. In that regard, the African space policy, in one of its objectives, also talks about when we are doing space activities, we need to enable transparency and confidence building measures to minimize the effects of space debris. That includes following the registration convention, for example. That is transparency to show that, oh, okay, we've launched 1,000 objects and we're taking ownership of that. And then the other conventions that Mukulu was talking about, they also enable this transparency and sustainability. Unfortunately, I will not dwell on that, but what I would talk about is that there is potential. There's a lot of potential for Africa to become a player by contributing to conversations on space sustainability, the principles, the standards that are currently being developed, and perhaps a new legal framework that is going to be developed. We need to hear Africa's voice on that. What are we saying? Because even if you don't launch a satellite, space debris will affect you. Like we know there's space debris that is falling in Kenya and in Ghana as well. So imagine a village that has probably no knowledge of space at all, and then things are just falling into their fields or their houses. So we need to make contributions to those sort of conversations. In conclusion, as you have seen, we are slowly investing more into space programs, but we should focus really on developing our own sovereign capacity. And I've inserted this graphic, which I got from Space in Africa, as you can see from their logo there. I want you to question yourself, what do you see from this graphic, especially when you're comparing active satellites, inactive satellites, lost satellites? Which ones are actually benefiting us and which ones are actually debris? With that, I thank you. I look forward to having a Q&A with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thando, for your insights. And now to welcome Tanushri Joshi, who is our third panelist for the day. She is a space and technology lawyer from India and a member of the working group on light pollution of the night sky from a space law perspective. Welcome, Tanushri.
Hi, thank you so much. And it was really great hearing from Mukulu and Thando about their insights, their experience on all of these aspects, and also highlighting a very key important point about how sovereignty is important, especially if you're a growing space nation, and sort of having your own terms, trying to understand where it's important to sort of divide your attention between what is your national capability, what is your national priority, as well as at the same time how you can contribute and look at to in international cooperation and coordination. Esther, I would just request you to maybe present my slides, please.
All right.
Or if you want me to, I can do that as well.
Yes, we will present them ourselves. Thank you. Oh, she started.
Oh. I hope you can see the screen.
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Okay, I think there's a bit of an issue. All right. What I would be mainly discussing today about is space debris, and that's the issue of uncontrolled reentry. Before we move on to the topic, I would sort of like to give an introduction about myself and what I do. I am a space lawyer and also a business development and strategy consultant. And I mainly work from India, but I've also worked on various international projects. And I do often work closely with HGAC or the IISL when it comes to policy or other working groups. In fact, 2 years ago, one of our reports of our working group on the dark and quiet skies was presented at the 62nd Bune Corpus Legal Subcommittee session, which essentially talked about how satellites and the light that they emit contributes or can pollute the dark and quiet skies, and we did a study report on that. As they have already highlighted the growing number of space objects in space, and what are the basis of space law. We will now move on to what space debris and the problem of uncontrolled re-entry is. Space debris is already an issue. So we'll be focusing on these 2 points, that is the issue of uncontrolled re-entry and what are the national and international initiatives that we have to address the issue of space debris and uncontrolled re-entry. So 2 aspects here: space debris are different and uncontrolled re-entry are different. The issue of space debris is something and somewhat related to space junk. Like you see, there's a lot of litter around on Earth. Can start from a simple plastic bag to a bottle to anything, or that we see that any building that is constructed but is in a bad shape and form and is not really being inhabited by anyone. The remains of the building are still there. It is also a debris. So anything that is not utilized, say maybe satellites or parts of your launch vehicles that just remain in space, that you do not have any control on, do not orbit around the Earth, are as good as space debris. And what happens when there is an uncontrolled re-entry is the sort of loss of communication with your own space object, because of which, and the Earth's orbital drag, what happens is you have all of these debris falling on back in the Earth's atmosphere, and they can either land up on land or in the sea. We've seen multiple examples of that in the recent times. In fact, this is an image that was a debris that fell in in Kenya. The image towards the right, the second image, is something, the space debris that fell in Australia. The left one is again a space debris that fell in Africa. And this is sometime in, I believe, in the Pacific Ocean. Even towards the end of last year and early this year, there have been a lot of flight delays and airline disruptions due to the potential of uncontrolled re-entries of many of these space objects. So where does this issue arise from and what can be done? Every country is willing to launch and having its own constellation. These are for two main important aspects of your national sovereignty, and also to have your own sort of technological independence. And there's a lot to do. So space and defense go hand in hand. As we've seen, there are so many geopolitical issues that are happening currently. We've seen how space is utilized for warfare and so on. So although there is a lot happening for good, and there's a lot of commercial aspects towards the space sector, it is still very closely associated with defense, and we cannot undo that. So with that, if there are a growing number of satellite constellations, if there are a growing number of launches, if there are a growing number of space objects that are launched, it can be your individual space stations, it can be your individual satellites, your satellites just for the sake of experiments, somebody trying to send food in space just to understand how it reacts in the space and the atmosphere there. What happens is we've started crowding the space. And because of gravity, because of the orbital drag, most times we lose control over these objects, which is how they come back to the Earth's atmosphere, like I mentioned. This mainly happens because at times there is no compulsion that is made for having an active control or a guidance mechanism. when you're trying to launch any space object. It might be your launch vehicle, that is your rocket, or it could also be a satellite, or it could be a payload within your spacecraft. So the issue is mainly about space debris and the lack of global database to track and control, although we have a couple of these databases available now. Second question is it really the problem of uncontrolled space objects and their re-entry, or is it about abandoned space objects? I try to launch a space object. I feel that it is no longer important for me to continue my experiment. I switch off the communication with my space object. I do not register it in the UN registration with the UN registration convention and what it mandates. And I no longer care about what it's doing and the experiments it's trying to undertake in space, which means that I'm abandoning the space object, which means that not just me, but anybody around who does not have that database will not be able to track this. So what happens is there are a couple of international initiatives that are being taken. Let me just... Okay. So there are a couple of these international initiatives that are taken. The question is, you need to take these international initiatives today, because if not now, when else would you? The problem is not just of space debris and uncontrolled re-entry. It is about managing the global capacity, the launch capacity, and the number of satellites or any space objects that's launched. Because if it's not controlled today, it can cause into multiple safety issues that will not just have problems on Earth, not just mainly on the land, but also with your entire aviation or space debris as well. What happens is, we've also heard about the Kessler syndrome, which means that because of the way the outer space is, a small fragment of any other satellite or any other launch vehicle collides with another space object, it creates multiple smaller space debris. Essentially, that adds into the space traffic jam, which is not controlled or cannot be controlled by anyone. So what are these other initiatives that UNOSA has taken to address these? We will firstly focus on that, and then let's move to a couple of regional and national initiatives. Because this is constrained towards a 15-minute talk, I would just limit myself to this. But after this call, perhaps by tomorrow, I would be happy to share a Word document sharing all of these articles and giving you a detailed run through what initiatives are taken in order to address the challenge of space debris and their uncontrolled re-entry. So at first, there is the long-term sustainability guidelines, which came up in 2019, 2020. What they do is they encourage you to address the risk from re-entering space objects and adopt best practices for mitigation and their notification. We also have the space debris mitigation guidelines, which came in 2007, and they were revised again in 2010. What it does is it limits the risk of uncontrolled re-entry by ensuring that they are disintegrated safely in the atmosphere. We also have another UN agency, and there are a couple of nations who are already a part of it, which is the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. It's the IADC. We again have the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters. I'm very proud to say that India is leading on that as of now. And then there is the international cooperation and capacity building initiatives and creating awareness. So we move on to the next slide, which we focus on what are the regional, what are the other aspects. First and foremost is the registration convention. Like Mukulu, Rana did give us a brief overview on what UN treaties are and what they were about. I would just like to explain in a bit of more depth. Convention on the registration of space objects was something is a very important aspect, because that lets you understand as to which country has launched how many space objects and how do you track them. there's a number assigned to it. And this is generally happens in twofold methods, wherein either it's the government addressing to the UN directly, or if it is a private spacecraft launching from, say, Kenya for that matter, it will notify the Kenyan Space Agency or any other nodal agency that takes care of such registration. And Kenya, on behalf of these private industries and private companies, will then register in the UN database, that is through the registration convention. And a certain registration number will be allotted to that. We've also seen, as she explained about ITU, there's a certain frequency that is allocated or that is assigned on which you're able to or allowed to operate. This also helps you understand as to how many of them are operating and how many space objects are there. Furthermore, there's also the agreement on the rescue of astronauts and the return of astronauts and the return of space objects launched into outer space. Very simply known as the rescue agreement. So what it also talks about is in case that you do find a space object in your land or somewhere in the sea, and this is something that you find, what you do is you notify the launching state. How do you figure out as to who is the launching state? Is by looking up to the registration convention, checking the UN database. I have attached a small screenshot on how that looks like. There are a couple of, these are also available in different languages, and you have a symbol document. Every country which is a spacefaring country and which essentially plans to launch this, updates this database as and when required, giving the number of satellites or any space objects that's launched from their country. And this is notified globally. So if there's a space object that fell in Kenya, and suppose Australia is the launching state, it is duty of Kenya to let the launching state know as to that there is a part of their own space object that fell in Kenya. It also helps you understand as to what happens, the return process and the procedure, who bears the cost, and related processes. The regional and national initiatives that are there. So Australia has also made registration of space objects mandatory, and especially for uncontrolled re-entry, given that there have been many such instances, not just in the recent times, but also a couple of years ago. The Australian government has a space debris, a space re-entry debris plan. As you have seen, as I'm sharing it on the screen, it helps, it sort of gives you an outline as to what steps are to be taken in case that a debris falls, and this is something that you're able to trace and locate. In terms of US, there have been a couple of other initiatives. You have the National Orbital Debris Mitigation Plan. FCC has changed a bit of rules. It's now important that you have, in case that you launch a space object, you have to have it deorbited within 5 years from its launch date. So there was a change in the 25-year-old limit to now making it to 5 years. In India, the in-space policy also advocates for the 5-year re-entry. And these are only a couple of countries or nations that I have listed down, but there are many such nations who are coming up with their own space laws or policies addressing and accepting the 5-year deorbiting mechanism. From what we see is, like Thando mentioned, that there is a lot of importance that space industry holds. There's a lot of data that's important from Earth observation and remote sensing for you to map your banking, insurance, agriculture, tourism. Many of these things, even surprisingly, the ATM that we have is because of the space technology or the satellite technology, to be specific about. So what happens is it's very important that technology and policy and regulatory and law matters are coordinated. Many countries are now using these latest technological solutions in order to map and track space objects. There are a lot of international initiatives towards sharing of your databases. You also have a concept of NOTAM that is there, wherein you notify the air traffic saying that you will be considering or planning to launch your space object or your rocket at a certain time, in which it issues a guidelines towards ensuring that there is no aircraft or any other space object flying your flight path. Secondly, states are also adopting the technology through policy perspectives, like the 5-year-old rule. What it tries to tell you is before countries, even given the example of India, if the national agency plans to give you the license to sort of launch your own space object, it studies as to how or what is your debris mitigation plan. Are your components in a way that can burn up while they're trying to re-enter? If not, how do you manage to control on that? How do you plan to guide them? Is there a way that they can go to the graveyard orbit, or what happens next? This is a practice that is also being adopted through policy and other regulatory notifications in various other geographies. Furthermore, there are a lot of funding grants and other support which is there to encourage private industry to take this up, to sort of design and execute some solutions. I have given some examples about active debris removal. There are ways of harpoons, nets, robotic arms, and laser ablation. Laser ablation is essentially to shoot down your space object or to sort of just make it vanish. While you have the robotic arms, is essentially a satellite will be launched, and the robotic arm sort of grabs the defunct satellite or a satellite that you want to throw it either in the graveyard orbit or push it down to Earth's atmosphere so that it burns up while it's re-entering. Like I mentioned, USA through FCC, India through InSpace, France through its own agency, Australia, and many other nations have adopted the 5-year-old deorbiting rule. What is more important for us is, as we're speaking about, let me just, am I still sharing my screen? Okay. So since we are here, what's more important for us is to draw a policy that is more essential and supports the Kenya Space Agency and the Kenyan private organizations' views and approaches towards this. This is for a reason is that privatization in Kenya and Kenya's space industry is still at a very nascent stage. So, of course, it's very important for them to have their own sovereign capabilities proven and shown in outer space. So adopting of these, advocating about what suits for your nation along with international obligations is of essence. There's a lot of coordination that is involved and that is essential. So that's a very important gist of space debris and how do you plan to, or what mechanisms already exist for controlling controlling the creation of space debris, or how do you protect yourself, or mechanisms on uncontrolled re-entry of space objects or space debris. So thank you, Esther, for this opportunity. Thank you, Mukulu and Thando, for your excellent presentations as well. I would stop now because I think I've exceeded the 15-minute timeline, but happy to share this afterwards. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Tanushri. And now it's time for our Q&A session, and we have a couple of questions from Letitia. And we would like to note that everyone is actually encouraged to type in their questions in the chat, including Gregory. So off to start with Letitia's questions, she asks for, and well, any of the panelists can actually answer this. So the first is, how can states be trusted to uphold space law's principle of responsibility for space damage when many of them still deny responsibility for climate damage, colonial violence, and environmental destruction on Earth? Second, she asks, why does the law protect outer space from harmful contamination but fail to protect the global south from climate disasters caused by the global north's emissions? Isn't that a legal double standard? Third, which I think Thando would be best suited to answer, is, and the fourth one as well, if space has no sovereignty, does that open a door for stateless people like indigenous communities or displaced nations to claim space differently outside the control of colonial borders? Fourth and finally, she asks, as negotiations for climate change and space governance happen in separate spaces, how do we bridge these conversations so that the global south does not lose out twice, once on Earth and again in space? So to address this, I believe Mukulu can start, then Thando, and then finally Tanushri. Yes, and the rest can still continue to type in their questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. And thank you, Letitia, for the questions. So the first one she asked, how can states be trusted? And an answer for me, which I hope is actually non-controversial in this audience, is that they can't. And I say they can't because history has taught us that governments and the concept of governments, as we have come to accept, pursues profit, and increasingly profit over human life and profit over anything else. So unfortunately, in the current organization, societal organization that we, whether willingly or unwillingly, have currently subscribed to, states are the mechanisms for which things are done and for which influence at an international level, for example, is made. So that's my starting point for it. That I think operating from a point of non-trust is not necessarily being pessimistic, but it's learning from history and being informed by what we've seen. And part of the reason I say they can't is because although we have these laws, so for example, for peaceful uses of outer space and for space debris, we hear whispers about countries that might, have long-term plans to put nuclear weapons in space, for instance. And we know that there are countries that have sent things, have sent satellites to space without a clear plan of controlled reentry. And there's actually some case law currently in America for a family that sued NASA because something fell in their backyard. And although it didn't hurt anybody, they're claiming, I think, about $80,000 for emotional distress and things like that. Interestingly, somebody has also sued the Kenya Space Agency for something similar, but with the Kenya Space Agency, it's slightly different because it was not their instrument. It was from another country, right? Anyway, so I say this to say that it cannot be up to the states, and so they must continue to be held accountable. We must continue to have scholars and civil society and other people who hold both the countries and the private sector accountable. And if we entirely let it to the states, then we continue to face the same things that we are seeing with climate change and colonial violence and environmental destruction, because a lot of times it's people, is profit over people. And what does the law protect outer space? I guess it's the same thing, right? So the law attempts to, because it's a collection of principles, but the abiding of it, and especially now it's very topical, is international law effective? And how do we have a regime of law while there's so much senseless death and so much destruction? And why is it that continuously people from the global south continue to suffer the repercussions of decisions that they're not party to? And I think it's Thando who was talking about why it's important that our voices are increased. And I'll give this as an example, not an anecdotal example, but a real example. The reports of Copios, for example, are a matter of public record. If you go to the United Nations Outer Space Office and look at the outcome from Copios, you will note how faint the voices of African states are and how little they contribute to the discourse there, right? And so apart from South Africa and more recently Burkina Faso and Egypt, I don't think any other country is as participating or is as vocal as it could be. And so we in a sense then allow the rest of the world to make laws and policies and then apply them to us. And so, of course, we're always going to be at a disadvantage because we receive and we don't participate. So I combine those two questions to say that in the spirit of, quote unquote, saving ourselves, we must do more to hold states accountable, to learn from the things that we've seen happening in climate change and in environmental disasters and in, the conversations around colonialism and law of the sea and all that. And our trust cannot be entirely in the mechanisms of the states because, again, we've seen how that has played in the past. Question 3 is interesting for me. I'd like to understand a bit more what sort of the person who asks it means in the sense of to claim space differently. Do you mean to claim to lay stake to space? Do you mean to deploy things to space? I'm not entirely sure that I fully understand question 3, so I'll skip it for now. And then lastly, in question 4, Actually, I think question 4 specifically would be is worth workshopping at some point and sort of like sitting with it a bit more. I really like it as a question and as a topic for something to think about properly, because how do we bridge these conversations? My first thing is, how do we get our governments to engage more? How do we get our governments to not cede to the needs of the global north and to what the spacefaring nations are determining will be how space is managed and how we navigate space? And how do we increase scholarship? How do we get louder? Because it's almost like Berlin Conference all over again, right? So people are now distributing the resources of space, and we're not being part of the conversation in a way that we could be. So Mwalimu Sipala, if you're online and you're listening, I would be very keen to workshop question 4. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that one. I think you tried to cover most of the questions. I was actually trying to digest question 3. Letitia, your questions are very technical and very thought-provoking. I love them. I want to guess then the meaning of the question pertaining to indigenous communities, displaced nations, and their ability to claim space in a different way. I think I would need more clarity on that question as well. But maybe just to comment, how would these individuals or these communities launch objects into space? What sort of capability do they use? How do they register their intent and their objects as well? From where do they launch? That's a question which also needs to be explored. The governance of space and the governance of Earth are not entirely divorced, so it's something that we also might need to explore. So unfortunately, I mean, I cannot really answer the question completely. And because I'm working in space for climate, I think I can talk about question 4 on negotiations for climate change and space governance. Yes, they do happen in separate spaces, but what I want to draw attention on is the theme of negotiations in general. If any one of you has been following the current meetings that are happening with Donald Trump at the White House, where he has hosted about 5 African leaders, have you seen sort of the demeanor there, where you have African, if you watch the videos, look at how African leaders are speaking, look at how they're presenting themselves. In one of the videos, the other guy was actually saying, oh, we have these minerals, with these minerals, with these minerals. And Donald Trump was like, I mean, make it quick. I know about that. Make it quick. What's the point? Enjoying a negotiation. So that also then takes the question back from, okay, is it a matter of the difference in the spaces in which they're negotiated, or the general stance that Africa has towards negotiation? And in my own personal opinion, there is really a need to move away from negotiation and we go into deal making. That has been a principle that was adopted by, let's say, China, for example, with its approach in foreign policy on Africa. Africa has never really been into diplomatic negotiations and, the human rights, aid, governance. They just come and say, okay, you want infrastructure, we can provide this and this and this. You want a loan, we can give you a loan at this rate. We don't care if you're corrupt, we don't care if you're respecting human rights and so forth. What we care about is the collateral of our loan. What happens when you fail to pay our money? Do we claim your minerals? What do we claim? So that's deal making, which is a bit different from negotiation because it considers certain factors. It's the same thing that we need to get into on climate governance. If you check the climate negotiations last year at COP, they went into the night and some countries walked away, the global majority or the global south, depending on how political you are with your language. They walked out and said, no, we're demanding whatever $1 trillion for loss and damage. And then they said, oh, we're walking away. And then a few hours later, you see them smiling in pictures saying, oh, we have agreed to a deal. The global north has agreed to finance about 250 billion, a quarter of $1 trillion for loss and damage. But then it's not like a contract. or a deal where you say, okay, this money is going to be paid. It's going to be paid by who and who and who. It's like, oh, we have committed to it. We're going to encourage certain behaviors for that. And then it then just ends up, in diplomatic kerfuffle. It's not really something actionable. So that's what I mean when I say we need to go back to deal making, because if we go back again to the example that I used on Starlink. So South Africa and the USA have been pulling at each other for quite a while now. And Elon Musk, who is born in South Africa, then says, oh, I want to launch Starlink services in South Africa. I want to provide satellite internet in South Africa. And then the South African government says, okay, that's okay. I mean, we can allow you, but our laws when we do international business at that level, remember, communication is a matter of national security as well. When we do business at that level, we need a certain percentage of the company that is providing services to be Black owned and locally owned. We're doing this to address the gap in capital accumulation that has happened over the years because of segregation. And then Elon Musk says, no, why should I give you part of my company? And then South Africa says, no, we don't want part of your company. Come and register a company in South Africa. And part of that company should have shareholders in South Africa, and they should be Black. It's called the Black Economic Empowerment Policy. And Elon Musk said, no, we can't. And then Elon Musk started tweeting a lot about South Africa, saying there are racist laws, they don't allow this, they are marginalizing white people, they're doing this. And then Trump got involved. He started saying the same things. And he even, made some claims that whites in South Africa are experiencing a genocide and so forth and so forth. And then the president of South Africa went to the White House and they met. If you saw the videos, it became a drama as well. It didn't go like Ukraine type of drama, but it became drama. A few days later, South Africa announces that, oh, we are relaxing our Black economic empowerment laws. We're going to change them in this way, in this way, in this way. So in other words, South Africa changed its laws in order to accommodate Starlink satellite internet. Why was it important for a country of 300 million people, that's the US, to gain a small market of about 60 million people in South Africa using satellite internet? So that's why then I say maybe it's not really about the difference in the negotiation rooms, but it's really about the stance in general on negotiation. Thank you for that. I won't attempt to answer the other questions.
So yeah, I think both of them have already addressed what I can summarize from what they've already spoken about is it's important to hold your sovereignty and your national importance, but at the same time also exploring on what is important for international cooperation, space sustainability and safety of all. It's important to stress on the word all, but not just to give away what is more important for your nation as well at the same time. It's to negotiate. While you're negotiating, you should also understand that you're equal at that same table, and it's not just a yes man that you have to be. You have to consider whether this really suits to your requirements or not. Whenever it comes to upholding the principle of space and space sustainability, responsibility, liability, you of course have the conventions. You have the Outer Space Treaty, you have the Registration Convention, you have the Liability Convention, which talks about who is liable. Is it a fault-based liability or is it like an absolute liability, and who's responsible and how it goes about. A very important aspect that's to be taken here is if a country is liable to another country. In case of you check, I think China's a part of China's space object fell recently. I think in Kenya, if I'm not wrong. There was another part where it fell in China itself. US has also seen a couple of these space objects that have been landed up on. Like Mukulu already gave that example. There's an important concept of space insurance that companies are mandated to take about. Essentially, what happens is there's a split in who owns how much in case if there is a liability that is incurred or there is a country that is held responsible. How do you split that up? There are limits that every country has. What's more also very important is addressing key challenges. We still do not know as to where the airspace ends and outer space begins, which is a very gray area in terms of, very easily diverging from your liability or responsibility. So it's more essential that we all agree on basic definitions of what a space object is, starting from that. How do you differentiate between airspace and outer space, and moving forward towards what space sustainability is? Um, I think there have been quite a lot of these questions. Few of them are already addressed. Um, Legal frameworks about ISS and so on, or how do you gain about your global south does not lose twice. Um, it is very essential that we do not give up on what our grounds are. So I completely agree with what Thando and Mukulu said and mentioned. It is important for you to hold your own conversations and to hold what your needs are at an international level also. Instead of plainly accepting them. So, what key takeaways are from here is there is an attempt that this international order, that the UN order that we have currently, is able to function. That UNOSA is really trying to sort of gain its own hands in governing what happens in outer space. It only matters in how we practice it in person and how states enable this. So, without taking much time, if there are further questions, I think Esther can send them to us and we could reply to you over email or get in touch with you for any of your further queries. But just thank you everyone for attending this webinar. It was lovely having this chat with all of you. And thank you to all the panelists and Esther for running this very smoothly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tanushri. Yes, there are in fact other questions, but as you have greatly suggested, they can be shared over email, as will be the same for the slides presentation. At this juncture, I would like to welcome Mr. Humphrey Sipala, who's Editor-in-Chief of Kabarak University Press and the co-host. Welcome, Mr. Sipala.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm very excited that we have launched our International Law Month at Kabarak 2025 with this conversation. Mukulu and I have been skimming a global majority conversation on space law for about a year and a half now. And this has been an exciting panel. Thank you so much, Mukulu. Thank you so much, Tanushri. Thank you so much, Thando, for your thoughts, for your insights. I think they speak precisely to what we wanted to have. Mukulu, I agree with you. I think question 3 from Leticia should be workshopped. This is the first of many conversations that we need to have. As we close, allow me to, I told Mukulu that I'll sit back and take notes because I'm learning from you guys. I've been taking notes, but I thought I probably should share something, maybe from a jurisprudential, from a philosophical point of view. I think international law really starts at that point where you cannot do something without affecting the interests of your neighbor state. Tanushri has given the example. If you want to launch something to space, there has to be some coordination so that, there are overflight concerns, there are other space objects that might be on your trajectory. And so you just cannot wake up and decide to do what you want, as may have been in the 60s, may have been in the 70s at the start of the space age. The constellations of micro satellites and the mushrooming, really, the overpopulation, one could say. If there is an overpopulation happening, it's in the lower Earth orbit with these constellations. And I think it's important that we begin, just like with the climate conversation that Letitia brought up and Thando has made reference to, that our consumerism, every time you enjoy the convenience of satellite internet at will, to what cost to society, to what cost to mankind. And if there ever was a regime of law that reminds us of the principles of the global commons, as Mukulu spoke at the beginning, it is space law. The unfortunate triumph of neoliberalism in the last 3 decades has allowed us to think that has allowed that certain conversations are not had. It makes it look like, it is normal, it is okay to have, blind state or private driven competition for profit to drive the use of common spaces. And so I would like to propose that when we, especially in the global majority, begin to discuss how we want to participate in space, not just necessarily as spacefaring nations, but also space-affected nations. And there have been 2 debris incidences in Kenya in January and April alone. I think I was sharing with Mukulu a week and a half ago, there was a re-entry event that was causing an explosive fireworks spectacle, and guys on TikTok record this stuff and put it out there. And I thought, in a world where these conversations are not had about how do we socially use commons together, in a world where neoliberalism has made the suggestion that there is such a thing as a tragedy of the commons, which is a historical description of how societies should govern what they commonly own. I thought we could remember how we use road reserves. Road reserves are, regardless of the political economy philosophy of the state you live in, road reserves are these thousands of acres, maybe square upon square kilometers of land that we all agree that nobody can use in a manner that hurts the other, that we must all use together. There's hardly any debate in any country that there is this piece of commonly owned land that we all must use within rules. It's not a capitalist conversation, it's not a communist conversation, it's not a socialist conversation, it's just good common sense. It's just what law exists for, to regulate interpersonal, intercommunity, interstate relations. And I thought, as we begin this, which I think is the first of many space law conversations that we will put together, I think there's probably a good jurisprudential basis to begin as an imagery of where we should go as space. Even though the space age has begun and not so many African states are spacefaring nations, I am reminded of another event in standard setting in the global commons, where Africa also provided an answer, and this was done in collaboration with what ended up being ALCO, the Africa and Asian Legal Consultative Committee, and that is the exclusive economic zone. It was in the mid-70s, not too long ago, after centuries of seafaring nations battling and cannoning each other and plundering each other to genocidal wars and all that, the 2 African young gentlemen convinced their states to come together to an African common position, which was negotiated with Asia. And we now have the formulation of the EEZ as was proposed by the global majority. The useful, sustainable use of space will also come from, I believe, a global majority conversation. And this is hopefully the beginning of this. Again, thank you so much, Tanushri, Mukulu, Thando, and to our audience. As is our tradition, we have recorded this and we'll have this up on our YouTube channel in an hour, maybe 2. And we keep the conversation going on. At the same time, we will be putting together a blog named in honor of a Kenyan scholar of international law who himself proposed cooperation rather than competition as the basis upon which we can relate together. And this was particularly international freshwater law, the principles that speak true to our conversation in space law. We hope to have these conversations on this platform as well, and continue to build the knowledge basis for which this kind of analysis can continue. Thank you so much again. This has been exciting. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sipala, for that. Well, we have come to the end of this. I didn't want it to end really, but it is worth noting that as a continent with a host of emerging spacefaring nations, it is vital to think along the lines of how to prepare legally and operationally to avoid contributing to debris, specifically in the era of AI race and the role of international law. Cooperation, as has been reiterated for space sustainability, is also a factor for consideration. So let's believe and pray. Loving Creator of the universe, as we draw this gathering to a close, we thank you for the wisdom shared and the hearts united in purpose. In the vast expanse of space, may we remember our call to stewardship, caring not only for our planet, but for the heavens above. Guide us as we navigate the complexities of law and justice, seeking cooperation across nations and cultures. May the dialogue we've begun today grow into meaningful action, driven by your spirit of peace, unity, and responsibility. Grant us humility to listen, courage to act, and grace to lead with compassion. We entrust our shared journey to you. Amen. Now, do have a good evening or morning from wherever you're joining us from. Bye. And yes, please do join us on the 18th for our next webinar. Goodbye.